So today I want to talk a little bit about how I avoid sourdough discard and also my 2-jar sourdough starter method. So I get asked this a lot. How do I avoid sourdough discard? I feel like it's wasteful. I don't want to throw any of it away. It took so long to make it and I don't want to throw it away. So I will be fully honest with you. I have only ever thrown away some of my sourdough starter probably about 5 or 6 times on average. And I've had my starter for almost 2 years now. So how I avoid throwing any of it away is I have a jar for my refrigerator. So this is my starter jar for my refrigerator. This lives in my refrigerator and I only pull it out when I am ready to make bread or baked goods or whatever I'm making that day. And then I have a container that I use for the counter, which is this one, a weck jar. Love these. I actually have 2 of them, but this is the one I use most often. So 2 containers. Refrigerator container for my inactive sourdough starter, aka sourdough discard, and container for my active starter. So that is essentially how I avoid discarding it. And I will explain that in detail now. So if you look in here, this is my inactive container or my discard container. I'm gonna scoot you back. We're getting really up close and personal here. So inactive container, if you look inside, there's really not a whole lot going on in there. So I keep a very small amount of starter in my inactive jar or my refrigerator jar. Usually a little bit more than this, but I would say on average about 20 to 25 grams of starter in this jar. So I think what happens is a lot of people will keep a really large amount of starter in their refrigerator or on their counter. And what happens is, especially if you leave it on the counter and you keep feeding it, because remember, if you leave your sourdough starter on the counter, it has to be fed at least every day or sometimes even twice a day. So if you're not using what you're feeding, after it ferments, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So a lot of people have to discard or throw some of it away, which is why I use the refrigerator as my friend, because if I put my starter in the fridge, remember the yeast and bacteria go dormant. So it still ferments a little, but not nearly as much as when it's on the counter. And so it's not gonna grow as much when it's in the refrigerator. So it lives in the refrigerator. When I'm ready to make bread or baked goods or anything with my starter and I need active starter, I pull this container out of the refrigerator and I feed a portion of it. Usually that's about 25 grams. I pull 25 grams out of here. I put it into my active container. I feed it. It ferments on the counter. Whatever's left in here goes back in the refrigerator. Stays in the refrigerator until this ferments, reaches its peak. Whatever I have left over from this after I make bread or bagels or whatever I decide to make that day, whatever's left from this container, as long as I'm not needing to make more bread or baked goods, goes into this container, and then this container goes back into the refrigerator. So it's a constant rotation, and that's how I keep it going, and that's also how I avoid throwing any of it away. So again, if I'm not using this, it just lives in here in the refrigerator. And when I pull it out, feed it in here, this ferments, the remainder goes back into here. And it continues going. When I'm ready to make bread again, this comes out of the refrigerator, I feed it in here, ferments, remainder goes back in here. If I want to make bread again that day after I've used whatever's in this jar, I just feed it directly into this container. It doesn't go back into the refrigerator. Another reason I like this 2-jar method is because this jar really never gets dirty. I wash it every once in a while. I will scoop it out and put it into another container and clean this one. but it doesn't really ever get crusty because it's always in the refrigerator. And I am a big fan of cleaning my starter jar. It's not something you necessarily have to do every day, but I do recommend doing it when your jar gets kind of nasty or crusty. I usually will wash my containers after every time I use it. So once I use this, scoop everything I can out of it, put it in here, this gets washed. Another reason I like the 2-jar method is because remember, the temperature really affects your starter. So anything cold is gonna really slow down the fermentation. So if I pull my starter directly out of the fridge and feed it in this container, the cold container is gonna slow down the fermentation. So these containers are always left at room temperature. So another big reason I like to use that method. That is how I do it. That is my 2-jar method. I know people that are bakers that will use 1 jar and they just feed it directly into that jar over and over and over. This is how I like to do it. This is how I teach my classes to do it. I encourage people to go home right from class and pick a container for the refrigerator and a container for the counter. Remember, the one that is left in the refrigerator can be sealed. The one that's on the counter is a loose cover on top. So that's how I do it. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comments. I would love to hear them. I would love to hear how you store your starter. This is what I have done since I started baking sourdough, and it works for me. If this isn't what you do, I would love to know what you do and what works for you, and I'll see you next time. Quickly want to demonstrate here. I have used the starter out of my counter container to make 2 loaves of sandwich bread, and I still have some left, so I'm luckily going to bulk up some of my refrigerator container because, as you saw, I didn't have a lot left. So now I'm just going to scoop it out and put it into my refrigerator container, and then it goes back into the refrigerator. I cannot say refrigerator one more time. Thanks for joining. See you next time.